السلام عليكم يا جماعة وحياكم الله. اليوم
أهلا وسهلا
نقدم لكم
فيكم
ستريم.
جميعا.
أهلين أهلين أخوي بدوي. بنتكلم اليوم عن خبر الاف ام سي، واتوقع مثل ما شفتوا اوريدي قالوا ان ما راح يرفعون، راح يثبتون الفائدة نفس ما هي. بهالستريم نبي نشوف الكلام اللي راح يقوله جيروم باول، نشوف لهجته، نشوف الامور اللي هو يعني ممكن يصرح عنها تدل على يعني تفاصيل اضافية. وهذا اهمية الاف ام سي، هي التعليقات يعني بعد ما يعلنون عن الفائدة. فالحين ايش كثر باقي على ما يدخل؟
بعد دقائق اعمل ريفرش إذا بدك عليه، بس إنه ما بعد الدقائق
اوكي.
ما فيك
لا هذا لايف.
هلا تثبيت سعر الفايدة هذا كان أمر متوقع، ما في شيء جديد يعني، في كلنا متوقعين وحكين عنه أكثر من مرة. هلا لهجة الحديث تبع جيروم باول هي اللي رح تأثر أكثر على الموضوع، شو رح يصير. البيتكوين لحديث هلا عم بيكون إيجابي، مثل ما حكينا امبارح تقريبا ارتدينا من 60,000 تقريبا. وش عم نشوف صعود، عم نقرب على الترند لاين. بدنا نشوف شو بده يصير وقت يوصل على الترند لاين هون، وعلى وقت نوصل لمنطقة 68,000. هون مناطق كتير مهمة. هل رح نكسر نعمل هاير لو، ولا رح نرتد نرجع مرة تانية على 60,000؟ هيدي أمور بدنا نراقبها. البيتكوين دوميننس هبطت شيء بسيط، لأنه وصلنا ل 64 64% امبارح، وهبطت شوي. قوة الدولار الأمريكي حتى الآن هبطت، ولكن هيدي على الاف او ام سي ميتينج دايما بحذركم أنا، بصير تلاعب بالأسواق بشكل كتير كبير. يعني القصة ما بتصير دغري صعود ولا دغري هبوط، بصير في ذبذبات ليحرقوا يعملوا تصفيات لللونجز والشورتس. يعني انتبهوا كتير من التلاعب صعودا ولا هبوطا بهالفترة. بيصير في تذبذبات كتير كبيرة. حسب لهجة جيروم باول الأسواق رح تتأثر، ولكن بياخد الأمر شوية وقت. هلا أول فترة بنشوف تذبذبات صعود وهبوط، بعدين بنعرف وين الاتجاه رح يكون. هيدي أمور لازم تاخدوها بعين الاعتبار.
يعني احنا شفنا آخر مرة أرقام التضخم شوي كانت يعني أعلى من المتوقع، وبنفس الوقت قاعد تشوف ان انت يعني الاس ام بي 500 عندك اول تايم هاي، بيتكوين كسر اول تايم هاي. يعني في كذا شغلة يعني ممكن يعني بشوف شنو تعليقاته على كل هذه الامور. هل هم يشوفون انه لازم يشددون اكثر، ولا يعني راح يستمرون على خطتهم اللي كانت يعني آخر مرة إنه يعني most likely بالفترة القادمة شهر 5 شهر 6 يرخون ويبدون ينزلون مستوى الفائدة، ولا لا؟ فالظروف تغيرت من آخر ميتنج، حتى لو هو ما رفع الفائدة ولا ما سوى شيء كبير ستيل راح يكون يعني مهم إن احنا نتابع شنو قرايته حق الموقف الحالي، خصوصا إنه صارت كل هذه التطورات بالفترة الأخيرة.
100%. هلا طلع خبر اليوم رح شارككم اياه لحظة. هلا طلع صراحة أنا بعدني واعي من النوم الساعة 4 صباحا بالبلد اللي أنا فيه، 4 5 صباحا، ولكن طلع خبر اليوم. آه هو عفوا رح شارككم اياه هون. ذاتس هيئة الأوراق المالية والبورصات السك عم تعمل حملة قانونية ليصنفوا الإيثيريوم كأوراق مالية كسيكيورتي. يعني شكلهم بدهم يصعبوا قصة الاي تي اف على المدى المنظور. قلت لكم جاري جانسلر بعد كل الكفوف اللي اكلهم مؤخرا اخذينه على المحكمة. القاضي حكم ضده، بده يكون ناستي بالانجليزي بيقولوا له، بده يكون يعني خبيث شوي بمعاملته المجال. ولكن القصة منا بإيده كتير يعني، ولا هلا في بلاك روك بس كل اللي فيه
بالضبط.
يعمله
يعني شوف،
كل اللي فيه يعمله
انا
فيه
اشوف ان
يأخر
هذا،
برأيي.
اي انا اشوف ان هذا يعني خصوصا توقيت الخبر. يعني انت تتكلم ان قبل اقل من 24 ساعة بلاك روك تعلن على الفند او الصندوق اللي هم بينزلون اللي فيه
100 مليون
100
دولار
مليون دولار يو اس دي سي حاليا. فانت عندك هذا التوقيت اللي نزل خبر ايجابي بشكل كبير، وانا اشوف ان الناس يعني ما عطوا الخبر هذا اهمية كبيرة، لانه يعني ترى خبر جدا كبير بالنسبة حق الاثيريوم وتواجدهم فيه. ولكن بسبب الهبوط آخر يومين الناس يعني قاعد تفكر بأشياء ثانية. بس عندك نفس هذا الوقت بعدها بيوم الاس اي سي تنزل وتطلع وتقول لك، او تطلع هذه الاخبار على سلبيه على الايثيريوم نوعا ما، وانهم بيسوون تحقيق وكل هذه الامور. فانا اشوف ان هذا يعني تقدر تقول نوع من انواع الفد بسبب اقتراب يعني ضغوطات عليهم على سالفه الايثيريوم اي تي اف. ايثيريوم اي تي اف ما بقى له شيء، واذا تشوفون الاخبار اللي كانت تطلع قبل البيتكوين اي تي اف كان في اخبار بنفس هذا المستوى سلبيه، والله البيتكوين راح نمنعه من ما ادري شنو ولا شيء كذي، يعني بنفس الطريقه يعني. والتوقيت يعني موضوع مو صدفه، انا ما اشوف ان المواضيع هذه تصير بالصدفه، متى
100%.
ينزلون الخبر وشنو يصير قبله وشنو المتوقع انه هو يصير. يا انهم يبون يعني ياثرون على الاي تي اف لان الوضع يعني صار ايجابي بشكل كبير بالنسبه له، او مثل ما قلت يعني بسبب التعليقات بلاك روك ولاري فينكس بالتحديد اللي طلع بمقابله امس وقال كلام يعني كلام قايله من قبل، اللي هو اهميه التوكنايزيشن والريل وورد اسيتس وكل هذه الامور، بس اللهجه مالته اكثر يعني انه جاهز انه هو يطبق ويبي ينفذ، ويعني يعني بولش بشكل عام. فما احس عجبهم هذا الكلام.
100%. شكرا اخي عبد الله بندر. وشكرا نورس كمان على دعمكم للقناة. ثانك يو. الدولار الامريكي تراجع شوي. اوكي، خلينا نحن بالانتظار نشوف شو في عنا احداث ثانية. رح وطي تشارت بين اليومي، انا بطلع على تشارت اليومي، رح وطيه على التايم فريم اقل يكون، لانه يكون هلا وقت تلاعب حتى نشوف اي حركة بالسوق سريعة. بتمنى عليكم، نحن عم نطلع معكم ليترلي هالاسبوع، انا طالع صار شي هيدي سابع مره بطلع لايف. بتمنى عليكم تعملوا لايك وسبسكرايب للشانل. في تقريبا 800 شخص على اللايف حاليا. اذا بتعملوا لايك وسبسكرايب بتكون بتدعموا القناه وبتساعدونا كتير بالالجوريثم تبع يوتيوب، بتخلوا العالم تعرف انه نحن على اللايف. هيدي امور بتساعدنا كتير.
واذا تقدر سوي شير بعد، سوي كوبي حق اللينك وسوي له شير، لان هذا شيء يعني يضيف بشكل كبير حق اليوتيوب، انه يعني الناس حابة تنشر هذا المحتوى.
100%. مبارك كمان بشكرك خيي على السوبر ستيكر.
اي، فبالنسبة حق الوضع الحالي الاقتصادي، يعني انت عندك انه بشكل عام في امور متناقضة، يعني في امور تدل ان احنا يعني داخلين على فترة سيئة اقتصاديا، وبنفس الوقت قاعد تشوف مؤشرات تقول لك ان لا والله الامور قاعد تتحسن والوضع يعني قاعد يصير افضل. فالوضع الحالي يعني حتى بالنسبة حق الفد هو غير واضح، وهم يعني راح يكونون حذرين من ناحية انه شلون يتصرفون بالفترة القادمة. هم لو يعني رخوا بشكل متسرع او مبكر شويه، يعني اتخذوا قرارات ترخي حق السوق ويعني ترد انه ينتعش اكثر مره ثانيه، هذا ممكن يجيب مشاكل سلبيه لهم على المدى الطويل اكبر. فهم الحين يعني بموقف حرج. يعني انت تخيل قاعد تسوق سياره، وانت قاعد تسوق السياره تبي تبدل مثلا التاير. هذا وضع الفد مع كمية الانفليشن، مع كمية يعني الأمور اللي قاعد تصير حاليا، يعني الدت على أمريكا واصل إلى مستويات مو طبيعية. فهم يعني ما لهم أي طريقة أنهم يطلعون من هالمشكلة كلها بشكل يعني آمن. هم على المدى الطويل مهما صار راح يردون يضطرون أنهم يطبعون فلوس ويعيدون أنهم يحاولون يداركون هذه يعني الأمور كلها. ف يعني انا اكلمك بشكل عام، يعني بشكل عام وضع الفد يعني صعب، ما عنده شيء يقدر يسويه.
عبد الله ضحكني، عفوا ما قدرت غير ما اضحك على تعليق عبد الله. ما قدرت غير ما اضحك.
الحين يطلع بسرعة.
يا هلا بيطلع. ليك بخصوص الوضع الاقتصادي شخصيا برأيي الوضع الاقتصادي في مشاكل، يعني في بعض المشاكل بالوضع الاقتصادي، ولكن ما رح يخلوا الاقتصاد يصير له شيء قبل الانتخابات. انا هيدا مؤمن بهالامر كليا. يعني عندنا الانتخابات الامريكيه رح تصير، ما رح يخلوا اي امر يحصل قبلها، ولا بل رح يخفضوا الفوائد قبل الانتخابات لحتى جو بايدن او الحزب الديمقراطي يبين انه هو شيء قوي كثير. هذا اللي رح يصير انا برايي، لانه هدفهم اكيد بدهم يخسروا ترامب. هذا الهدف تبع الحزب الحاكم حاليا. اذا بده يصير شيء اقتصاديا، مع انه الوضع العالمي مش بس امريكا، العالمي منه كتير جيد. اذا بده يصير شيء بدها تصير يعني ببدايه 2025. انا يعني اذا بده يحصل شيء على الوضع الاقتصادي العالمي حاليا السنه هيدي،
صحيح.
انا برايي رح تكون بولش على كل الاصول الخطيره والكريبتو والاسهم.
معك يعني انا ما اتكلم على مدة الاشهر القادمة، بس
yeah.
يعني صح مثل ما يعني اتفق معاك 2025 او يعني نصها بدايتها من Q2 تقريبا لنهايتها في شيء ممكن يصير. بس انت عندك نفس الوقت انه لو هم بدوا ان هم يعني والله ما راح يسوون شيء حاليا وبعدين فاز ترامب، لما يفوز ترامب صدقني هو راح يبلش العهد ماله هذا، ما راح يسمح انه يصير فيه اي كراش، راح يبدي بقوة، راح يبدي يسوي تاكس كاتس، راح يسوي امور. فانت يعني شلون
معك انا،
ممكن
ولكن رح يحاربوه بشكل كتير كبير. وهو في عندك فترة بعد ما يربح، فترة 3 ل 6 اشهر، 3 اشهر اي ثينك الهاند اوفر بتكون مثل، بيكون بعد القصة
ترانزيشن.
بإيد بايدن لدرجة معينة. هيدي الفترة أنا برأيي رح بدهم يحطوا التهم كلها على، يعني كل شيء بيصير عاطل بالاقتصاد، الإعلام كله رح يحطوا على ترامب إذا ربح. هذا إذا ربح، لأنه في كمان حديث ثاني على ميشيل أوباما ترجع تفوت. آه
ايه صح.
إذا ربح ترامب بدهم يحطوا كل الوضع السيء بتعرفوا كيف الإعلام بيحاربوا كليا. بغض النظر انا ما يهمني لا ترامب ولا بايدن يعني بالنهايه، بس عم بحكيكم انا شو انا بحس ترامب للاقتصاد افضل، ولكن الاعلام والسياسه الحزب الديمقراطي شوي خبيثه. انا هذا اللي بشوفه.
مهم. في سوبر شات 10 دولار من سنان.
سنان، مساء الخير اخ بدوي. بدر، عفوا اسمي بدوي مش بدر انا. ممكن بعد اذنك تشوف لك لك هلا بشوف العملات رح شوفها اذا شيء بعدين. هلا لانه بدنا نركز شوي على الاف او ام سي ميتنج خيي، ولكن بنشوفها بعدين اكيد ما في مشكله.
انا اتوقع عندي فكرة عن هذه العملة
عندك
بس
فكره؟ اوكي،
بنتكلم
اذا
عنها
فيك
بعدين.
تحكي عن.
اي مو متأكد انا 100%، بس اتوقع هذا مشروع ليكويتي، هو يعني مشروع دي فاي. تقدر ان انت تاخذ والله ستيبل كوين، يسوون الجوريثمك ستيبل كوين من الايثيريوم، اتوقع موجود على الايثيريوم. يعني فكرتها حلوة، ويعني لأن بس إنه بنفس الوقت في بعض المخاطر من سالفة الستيبل كوينز اللي هي تكون الجوريثمك، يعني أنت عارف هذه الأمور، بس الطريقة اللي هم يوازنون فيها مستخدمة يعني كولاترال عالي، هذا اللي عارفه. فيعني نوعا ما أأمن من الطرق اللي نفذوا فيها الستيبل كوينز من قبل. فهذا اللي عارفه. It's basically يعني ديفاي لونز وعرفت بوروينج وهالامور.
ده بالاكس ار بي تحت 60 الامور طيبه. الاكس ار بي ثابت له فتره، يا هو والكاردانو صراحه.
صار اي ستيبل كوين.
يا بوم.
بس
رجع
انت
ارسال.
في شغله، في شغله انا يعني الاحظها بالنسبه حق اكس ار بي، يعني ما ادري اذا انت تلاحظها، انه يعني من بين كل العملات لما اشوف واحد يعني بحياتي الصجيه وهو يقول لي انه هو مهتم بالكريبتو، موست لايكلي يقول لي اكس ار بي. فانا مو فاهم ليش الناس
انا
العاديه
انا بقول لك
ما
انا
يعرف
بقول لك
شيء. امم.
انا بقول لك ليه. لانه بيطلع اذا شخص عادي داخل على المجال، انت تخيل حالك ما بتعرف شيء بالكريبتو، بتفوت بتطلع على الكوين ماركت كاب او حيلا ويب سايت على اهم كريبتو، رايت؟ بتشوف بيتكوين 60 70 الف، بتشوف اثيريوم 3 4000 دولار، بتشوف بي ام بي وسولانا بال 200 300 دولار 400 دولار يلي هي بي ام بي، ما بعرف قد سعرها حاليا. بتشوف هالاسعار بتشوفها غاليه، بترجع بتشوف كاردانو اكس ار بي 0.6 و0.5 و0. مدري شو، تقول اوكي شو تفكر انت؟ هدول بيقولوا له النيو انتري، العالم اللي بتفوت الجديده، بتشوف سعره منخفض، بتدخل فيه تعمل فومو وبتدخل فيه بشكل عام. هذا بيحصل عادة. ليه العالم بتفوت
يعني
كتير بالميم كوينز؟ العالم الجداد اللي ما
هذا
بتفهم بشيء
يسمونه
بتفوت.
يونت بايس. إن
yeah.
لما الشخص يفكر لأن في 5 أصفار يفكر والله لو وصل الدولار راح يصير عندي 10 مليون كذي
ما
يفكر.
هي لا، بيفكروا اول ما يفوتوا على المجال يفكروا الميم كوين رح تصير بسعر البيتكوين. كتير عالم
ايه
تفكر هيك، يعني انه اتس هيدا الامر بيخلي هالامور هي الفومو بيجي بيفكروا انه
بس
اوكي.
الشغلة الثانية اللي أنا لاحظتها ليش الناس تدخل بإكس ار بي، لأنه يدخل كريبتو يومين ولا يدخل أسبوع يسوي ريسيرش بسيط، بعدين يقول لي اكس ار بي راح عندهم شراكه ويا البنوك، بيتكوين يعني ما عنده شراكه ويا البنوك، فاكس ار بي افضل شيء، عرفت؟
لكن
عندهم
نحن ما
هذه
نحن
النقطه
شباب، بس
يصيدونها.
لخبركم نحن مش عم نحكي ضد الاكس ار بي يعني، ولكن ما فيكم تقارنوا. انا كل اللي عم نقوله ما فيكم تقارنوا الاكس ار بي وكثير من العملات مع البيتكوين. البيتكوين بليفل خالص كليا. البيتكوين عليها
ايه
institutional adoption، تبني مؤسساتي حاليا يعني. ومش عم بحكي انه انا ماني بيتكوين ماكسي، بتعرفوني انا
والبيتكوين
بحب الالت كوينز اكثر، ولكن عم بحكيكم منطق للعالم تكون توقعاتها منطقيه، ما تكون توقعاتها مثل unrealistic، غير واقعيه.
بالضبط انا معاكو. يعني انا اسف لو اي احد يعني عنده اكس ار بي ومو عاجبه هذا الكلام، بس انا اتكلم عن الشخص الجديد اللي يدخل حق المجال ما يعرف شيء. هو يعني حتى ما يعرف شنو بالضبط الفكره وراء اكس ار بي. هو قاعد يتجه حق اكس ار بي عشان انه والله في كولابوريشن مع بعض البنوك، واصلا هذا شيء ضد الفكره الاساسيه اللي انخلق فيها الكريبتو. يعني انت كريبتو انت موجود فيه حق ديسنتراليزيشن، حق انه يعني نو ميدل مان، نوت يور كيز نوت يور كوينز، ويعني متجه حق مشروع مبني على اساس البنوك. ما نبي نتكلم احنا عن ايجابيات وسلبيات اكس ار بي، فخلنا ننتقل. رجع الفايف مينت شارت مالتك، وما بقى شيء اتوقع وراح يبلش الميتنج.
قرب الميتينج هلا، بس عم بطلع على كم شغله. شو بيصير لو بيع مايكل سايلر البيتكوين؟ الله لا يجربنا يعني. هلا اكيد رح يكون سلبي، ولكن بعتقد مايكل سيلر اذا باع، بعتقد كثير عالم غيره رح يشتروا كمان، ولكن بده يهبط السوق بشكل كبير. هذا الثور الدائم مايكل سيلر، بيشتري دائما هذا.
وصل 1%، وصل
yeah.
1% من
بس
التوتال سبلاي.
بس اذا بتفكر فيها بظرف شهرين بلاك روك صار معهم اكثر منه.
يا
بظرف شهرين يعني.
يا بس ما في
اعطيهم.
مقارنة. يعني بلاك روك اي تي اف، يعني مو بلاك روك نفسهم يتحكمون، اي
لا لا،
الشخص اللي
100
شرى
100
الاي تي اف يقدر يبيع.
100% انا
ايه
معك، ولكن بظرف شهرين عم نحكي 2 months.
امم
2
يا
months صار معهم. هو له 10 سنين بيشتري.
شوف خلنا اقول لك شيء يعني مهم، يعني يمكن الناس ما تتكلم عنه الحين. يمكن احنا الحين متحمسين بشكل كبير ومستانسين على كل هذه الاحداث اللي قاعده تصير، ودخول انستتيوشنز والسيوله اللي قاعد تدخل والالوكيشنز، كل هذه نار. بس ترى على المدى الطويل احنا لازم ما ننسى ان ترى هذا الدخول راح يكون له اضرار. اول شيء الانستتيوشنز هذه المؤسسات راح تطلب كنترول على المجال بشكل مباشر او غير مباشر. ممكن نشوف قوانين تطلع تكون والله ضد السيلف كاستدي، ضد ان انت والله تحتفظ على عملاتك الخاصه بمحفظتك الخاصه. فعلى رغم ان احنا مثلا متحمسين بالنسبه حق هذه الاخبار، ترى على المدى الطويل راح يردون هذه الانستitute. مو داخلين ببلاش، هم مو داخلين عشان بس تو بامب يور باجز، يرفعون عملاتك وخلاص انت تبيع عليهم وتمشي. راح يسوون هم يعني نوع من انواع السيطره على المجال. راح يسوون الموف هذا يمكن بالبير ماركت القادم. خلاص يعني يصير عندهم قبضة قوية على المجال، وتلقاهم يبدون يشرعون، وعندهم طبعا كونكشنز مع اللي يسوون القوانين والامور هذه كلها.
يعني انا
اتوقع بلش
حكيها
الحين
اكثر من مره
ببلش.
صراحه، نفس الموضوع. بلاك
امم
روك منه صديقك. بلاك روك ما هدفه غير مصلحته هو. هذا هدفه. عبد الله الاكس ار بي ل $589 2050. اول شيء عايشنا ل 2050، خلينا نعيش لوقتها. 25 26 سنه من هون. الله يعيشنا. لا يمكن التضخم بالولايات المتحده يصير مدري قد ايه ويوصل السعر هيك، يمكن يصير لانه قيمه الدولار الامريكي زباله تصير من هلا لوقتها. ممكن بس غير هيك صعب. شو 589؟ مش منطقي هذا الرقم.
بس والله اللي مسوي هولد على اكس ار بي، ويعني كل هذا الفد اللي احنا نقوله هم يعني يتمسكون، ترى والله قوي. لان انت تتكلم عن عملة ما تخطت الاول تايم هاي من 2017. يعني تتكلم عن ريال قاعد يسوي هودل 6 سنين. ترى هذا دايموند هاندز. فيعني ريسبكت حق الناس، احترمهم اللي لحد الحين متمسكين وما يأثر فيهم كل هذا الكلام.
انا ليك انا عندي قوه خاصه. كل ما نام انا بيعلى سعر البيتكوين. عم يطلبوا مني المجتمع عم يطلب مني اروح نام بركي بيعلى سعر البيتكوين. وصل الدون جيروم باول.
اشوف الصوت واضح. اذا الصوت تبون نطول
Good
عليه.
afternoon.
Yeah.
My colleagues and I remain squarely focused on our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. The
هدفنا
economy has
نثبت
made
الأسعار.
considerable progress toward our dual mandate objectives. Inflation has eased substantially while the labor market has remained strong. And that is very good news.
التضخم
But
انخفض
inflation is still
بينما
too high.
فرص
Ongoing
العمل
progress in
بعدها
bringing
قوية.
it down is not assured, and the path forward is uncertain. We are fully committed to returning inflation to our 2% goal. Restoring price stability is
هدفنا
essential to
نوصل
achieve a
التضخم
sustainably strong labor
2%.
market that benefits all. Today, the FOMC decided to leave our policy interest rate unchanged and to continue to reduce our securities holdings.
قررنا نثبت
Our
الفايدة
restrictive stance of
ونخفض
monetary policy has been putting
السكيورتي اللي
downward pressure
بنحمله.
on economic activity and inflation. As labor market tightness has eased and progress on inflation has continued, the risks to achieving our employment and inflation goals are moving into better balance. I will have more to say about monetary policy after briefly reviewing economic developments. Recent indicators suggest that economic activity has been expanding at a solid pace. GDP growth in the fourth quarter of last year came in at 3.2%. For 2023 as a whole, GDP expanded 3.1%, bolstered by strong consumer demand as well as improving supply conditions.
الناتج الإجمالي المحلي
Activity in the housing sector
ارتفع.
was subdued over the past year, largely
الحركات
reflecting high mortgage rates. High interest rates also appear to have weighed on business fixed investment. In our summary of economic projections, committee participants generally expect GDP growth to slow from last year's pace, with a median projection of 2.1% this year and 2% over the next 2 years. Participants generally revised up their growth projections since December, reflecting the strength of incoming data, including data on labor supply. The labor market remains relatively tight, but supply and demand conditions continue to come into better balance.
العرض والطلب عم بيقرب ببالانس توازن أفضل.
The unemployment rate has edged up but remains low at 3.9%. Strong job creation has been accompanied by an increase in the supply of workers, reflecting increases in
نسبة
participation
البطالة عم
among
تتحسن،
individuals aged
عم
25
بتقل
to
كثير
54
وعدد
years
الوظائف عم
and
بيزيد،
a
وهذا
continued
شيء
strong pace
بيفرجي
of
قوة
immigration.
الاقتصاد.
Nominal wage growth has been easing and job vacancies have declined. Although the jobs to workers gap has narrowed, labor demand still exceeds the supply of available workers. FOMC participants expect the rebalancing in the labor market to continue, easing upward pressure on inflation.
عم بيعتقدوا انه الليبر ماركت
is 4.0% at the end of this year and 4.1% at the end of next year. Inflation has eased notably over the past year, but remains above our longer-run goal of 2%. Estimates based on the Consumer Price Index and other data indicate that total PCE prices rose 2.5% over the 12 months ending in February, and that excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 2.8%. Longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of
عم يحكي بعده
surveys of
ملخص يعني
households,
عن وضع
businesses, and
الاقتصادي العام
forecasters,
يعني
as
بشكل عام
well as
عم
from
بيعيد
measures
الامور
from financial
انه
markets.
هدفنا بعده 2%
The median
عم نوصل
projection in the
عم
S&P for
يهبط
total
التضخم
PCE
ولكن بعد ما
inflation
وصلنا على
falls to
الهدف
2.4%
تبعنا.
this year, 2.2% next year, and 2% in 2026. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. The committee decided at today's meeting to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at 5.25% to 5.5%, and to continue the process of significantly reducing our securities holdings. As labor market tightness has eased and progress on inflation has continued, the risks to achieving our employment and inflation goals are coming into better balance. We believe that our policy rate is likely at its peak for this tightening cycle, and that, if the economy evolves broadly as expected, it will likely be appropriate to begin dialing back policy restraint at some point this year. The economic outlook is uncertain, however, and we remain highly attentive to inflation risks.
هالسنة إذا كفت
We are prepared to maintain the current
الأمور
target range
الاقتصادية
for the federal funds rate for longer, if appropriate.
بالاتجاه اللي رايحته.
We know that reducing policy restraint too soon or too much could result in a reversal of the progress we have seen on inflation.
بنعرف إذا عملنا الرخاء الاقتصادي يعني خفضنا الفوائد هالشيء يمكن يرجع يعيد التضخم وعم نراقب هالأمر.
Reducing policy restraint too late or too little could unduly weaken
ولكن
economic activity and employment.
بنفس الوقت إذا ما خفضنا الفوائد رح عنده تأثير على الاقتصاد. لذلك بدنا ندرس المعطيات اللي عم تجينا بشكل دقيق.
The committee does not expect it will be appropriate to reduce the target range until it has gained greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably down toward 2%. Of course, we're committed to both sides of our dual mandate, and an unexpected weakening in the labor market could also warrant a policy response. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting.
رح نرجع نعمل قراراتنا بعد كل
FOMC
اجتماع.
participants wrote down their individual assessments of an appropriate path for the federal funds rate based on what each participant judges to be the most likely scenario going forward. If the economy evolves as projected, the median participant projects that the appropriate level of the federal funds rate will be 4.6% at the end of this year, 3.9% at the end of 2025, and 3.1% at the end of 2026.
شو توقعات أعضاء الفيدرالية؟
These projections are not a committee decision or plan. If the economy does not evolve as projected, the path for policy will adjust as appropriate to foster our maximum employment and price stability goals. Turning to our balance sheet, our security $0.5 trillion since the committee began reducing our portfolio. At this meeting, we discussed issues related to slowing the pace of decline in our securities holdings. While we did not make any decisions today on this, the general sense of the committee is that it will be appropriate to slow the pace of runoff fairly soon, consistent with the plans we previously issued.
أغلب الأعضاء
The
بيعتقدوا
decision
إنه
to
لازم
slow the pace of
نخفض
runoff does not mean that our balance sheet will ultimately shrink by less than it would otherwise, but rather allows us to approach that ultimate level more gradually. In particular, slowing the pace of runoff will help ensure a smooth transition, reducing the possibility that money markets experience stress and thereby facilitating the ongoing decline in our securities holdings consistent with reaching the appropriate level of ample reserves. We remain committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keeping our longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for
إعادة
achieving
ثبات
maximum
الأسعار
employment and
أمر
price
مهم
stability
كتير
over the
بالنسبة
long
لنا.
term. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission.
كل
We
شيء
at the
بنعمله
Fed will do
هو
everything we can to
هو
achieve our maximum
لمساعدة
employment and price
الهدف
stability
تبعنا
goals.
والناس.
Thank you.
بشكركم. هلا كل هذا كان متوقع بعده هو ذاته. هلا الأسئلة أهم والجواب عن الأسئلة كتير مهم.
The projections show somewhat higher core inflation. They also show somewhat stronger growth. What should we infer from this notion that on average rates were kept the same this year, but inflation is higher and growth is higher? Does it mean more tolerance for higher inflation and less of a willingness to slow the economy to achieve that target?
It doesn't. No, it doesn't mean that.
نسب الفايدة الثابتة كانت هالسنة بينما التضخم مرتفع. برأيك هل الاقتصاد بيقدر يتحمل هالأمر أكثر؟
Forecast, and so have many other forecasters. So the economy is performing well. And the inflation data came in a little bit higher as a separate matter, and I think that caused people to write up their inflation. But nonetheless, we continue to make good progress on bringing inflation down. And so,
when you just to follow up, when you say that you're willing to either maintain the rate for longer, what is the tolerance of the Federal Reserve for inflation coming in above its 2% target?
So we're strongly committed to bringing inflation down to 2% over time. That is our goal, and we will achieve that goal.
هدفنا نوصله ل 2% مع الوقت ورح نوصل لهدفنا.
Happen over time, but we stress over time. And so,
بس عم بأكد إنه مع الوقت
we're making projections
مش
that
دغري.
do show that happening, and we're committed to that outcome, and we will bring it about.
Hi, Chair Powell, Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thanks for taking our questions. You and others have been saying that relief on housing inflation is coming, but it still hasn't shown up meaningfully in the CPI or the PCE. Does that challenge your assumption about when the shift will finally break through, since it hasn't at that point?
So I think there's some confidence that the market rents, lower market rent increases that we're seeing will show up in measures of housing services inflation over time. There's a little bit of uncertainty about when that will happen, but there's real confidence that they will show up eventually over time. But again, uncertainty about the exact timing of that.
And will you be able to get overall inflation down to target if housing doesn't break through quickly, and does that affect the timing for eventual cuts this year?
We will get aggregate inflation down to 2% over time. We will. And I would assume that what we'll continue to see is we'll see goods prices coming into a new equilibrium where they're going down perhaps not as quickly as they had been earlier this year, where housing services inflation will come back down as current market rents are suggesting will happen, and where non-housing services will move back down. Some combination of those three things, and it may be different from the combination we had before the pandemic, will be achieved and will bring inflation back down to 2% sustainably.
هدف يرجع التضخم ل 2%. ما في شيء بعد ما صار شيء.
Nick Timmeros of the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, during your congressional testimony this month, you said that your test for making the first change to interest rates does not require you to be terribly comfortable that inflation is at 2% because interest rates are well above neutral. At the same time, you said here after the last meeting that the first cut is highly consequential. Can you reconcile these views for me? If rates are well above neutral, why would the first cut be highly consequential? Is that because you anticipate one cut would be followed by one or two more along the lines of the recalibration you made in 2019, which itself was modeled on the mid-cycle adjustment of 1995?
It's more, I would put it more in the context of what I said in my opening remarks.
عم بيقول له انه في تناقض بحديثك في ايه من فترة امتى بدك تخفض التضخم للاقتصاد؟
You know, if we ease
ليه
too much
هالامر
or
عم
too
بيصير؟
soon, we could see inflation come back. And if
عم
we ease
بيقول
too late, we could do unnecessary harm to
عم بيقول إذا خفضنا بسرعة بيرجع التضخم، إذا خفضنا ببطء ممكن نأثر على هيك. لازم يكون الأمر مدروس قبل ما نعمل أي حركة بالأسواق.
With the labor market strong and with inflation coming down, we can approach that question carefully and let the data speak on that. That's really what I was thinking.
How much of that inflation that we've seen so far this year do you chalk up to one-off calendar adjustment effects following a period of high inflation versus some change in the trend we saw in the second half of last year?
I want to start by saying I always try to be careful about dismissing data that we don't like. So you need to check yourself on that, and I'll do that. But I would say the January number, which was very high, the January CPI and PCE numbers were quite high. There's reason to think that there could be seasonal effects there. But nonetheless, we don't want
يمكن
to be
يكون
completely
بسبب
dismissive of it. In
الموسم. هو
February,
عم بيقول
number
موسم
was
أعياد
high,
بالولايات
higher than
المتحدة.
expectations, but we have it at currently well below 30 basis points core PCE, which is not terribly high. So it's not like the January number. But I take the two of them together, and I think they haven't really changed the overall story, which is that of inflation moving down gradually on a sometimes bumpy road toward 2%. I don't think that story has changed. I also don't think that those readings added to anyone's confidence that we're moving closer to that point. But
الدولار الأمريكي نحن عم نحكي هبط هبوط جميل صار 103.5. بس هيدي في تذبذبات تذكروا ما بصير هيدي حركات سريعة انتبهوا منها.
Signal out of that. What you heard us saying was that we needed to see more, that we could, we wanted to be careful about that decision, and we're not going to overreact as well to these 2 months of data, nor are we going to ignore them.
Hi, yes, Chair Powell. Could you speak a little bit more about the timing? Is there enough data between now and, say, May to be able to get the kind of confidence that you say that you still need? Or by June, is there enough data for you? Just give us a sense of your thinking there. Thank you.
Yeah, so we make decisions meeting by meeting, and we didn't make any decisions or about
كل اجتماع بناخذ قراراتنا ما بناخذ قرارات للمستقبل لأنه حسب المعطيات اللي عندنا إياها.
Outlook and the balance of risk. So I really don't have anything for you on any specific meeting looking forward.
ما فينا نعطي رأينا قبل ما يصير المعطيات ونعمل اجتماعاتنا.
We'll take, things can happen during an intermeeting period if you look back. Unexpected things, so I wouldn't want to dismiss anything. So I just would say that the committee wants to see more data that gives us higher confidence that inflation is moving down sustainably toward 2%. I also mentioned, and we don't see this in the data right now, but if there were a significant weakening in the data, particularly in the labor market, that could also be a reason for us to begin the process of reducing rates. Again, there's nothing in the data pointing at that, but those are the things that we'll be looking at coming meetings, and without trying to refer to any specific meeting.
Chris.
Hi, Chris Rieger, Associated Press. Thank you. In the projections, there is an increase in the neutral rate, as you know, and higher rates, a quarter point higher rates projected in 2025, 2026. Can you speak about what might be behind that? Is there a real sense here that the economy has perhaps changed
بتمنى
in
عليكم
some
تعملوا
way
لايك
that higher
وسبسكرايب يا
rates will be
شباب.
needed
في
in the
بس
future?
340 لايك وفي 1900 شخص عم يحضروا البث.
You're right, they're pretty modest
بتمنى
changes, but
تعملوا
you're
لايك
right, there was an
وسبسكرايب
uptick
للقناة.
in the longer run rate, and also there's a 25 basis point increase in 25 and 26. In terms of are rates going to be higher in the longer run, if that's really your question, I don't think we know that. I think we think that rates were generally low during the pre-pandemic, post-global financial crisis era for reasons that are mostly, important, slow-moving, large things like demographics and productivity and that sort of thing, things that don't move quickly. But I don't think we know. I mean, my instinct would be that rates will not go back down to the very low levels that we saw where all around the world there were long-run rates that were at or below
برأيي ما
zero.
رح نوصل للنسب اللي كانت قبل جائحة كورونا لأنه كان في كتير أمور
Just a
ساهمت
quick follow
بهالأمر.
on the projections, you also have 2.6% core inflation for the end of this year. It's already or you mentioned it being 2.8 in February. I mean, that doesn't sound like much disinflation at all. So are you still confident, or the last press conference you sounded pretty optimistic you would get more confidence through the end of this year. Is it right to say that this suggests you're not seeing a lot of disinflation this year compared to what we've seen?
هل المعطيات اللي عم بتشوفها ما بتقول إنه ما عم ينخفض بنسبة قوية التضخم؟
We've seen so far this year, because you're now in this year. So I think that. Sorry, say your last part of your question again.
Well,
are you still optimistic that you'll get the confidence?
هل انت متفائل انه رح توصل للارقام اللي بدك اياها؟
I think if you look at the SEP, what it says is that it is still likely in most people's view that we will achieve that confidence and that there will be rate cuts. But that's really going to depend on the incoming data. It is. The other thing is, in the second half of the year, you have some pretty low readings, so it might be harder to make progress as you move that 12-month window forward. Nonetheless, we're looking for data that confirm the kind of low readings that we had last year, and give us a higher degree of confidence that what we saw was really inflation moving sustainably down to 2%, toward 2%.
كله عم معلق على 2%، كله عم يحكي انه على 2%.
Gina Smilik, The New York Times. Thank you for taking our questions. Per your comment to Anne that a weakening in the labor market would be a reason to potentially cut rates, or at least a consideration in making a rate cut, would continued strength in the labor market be a reason to hold off on rate cuts? And just in general, if labor supply continued to rebound in 2024 the way it did in 2023, what would stronger hiring and possibly stronger growth mean for the path forward on policy?
Yeah, so if what we're getting is
البيتكوين صعدت لتقريبا 64,700
because workers are getting paid and they're spending, and that's, you know, what you would have is potentially
أجوبته مدروسة، ما بده يأثر بالسوق، ما بده يكون كثير بيحسب حساب كل كلمة، لأنه أي كلمة بتلاعب بالسوق بشكل كثير كبير.
If you have the continued supply side activity that we had last year with both with supply chains and also with growth in the size of the labor force.
But so strong hiring in and of itself would not be a reason to hold off on rate cuts?
No, not all by itself, no. I mean, we saw, you saw last year very strong hiring and inflation coming down quickly. We now have a better sense that a big part of that was supply side healing, particularly with growth in the labor force. So in and of itself, strong job growth is not a reason, you know, for us to be concerned about inflation.
البيتكوين عم يصعد.
Hi, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. How do you assess the state of financial conditions right now?
And I think هناك في شيء عم بيصير جميل عم نلاحظه. كل ما تفقسوا لايك انتم سعر البيتكوين عم يعلى. فقسوا لايك اكثر بيطلع سعر البيتكوين.
There are many different financial conditions indicators, and you can kind of, you know, see different answers to that question. But ultimately, we do think that financial conditions are weighing on economic activity, and we think you see that.
Yes, the live screen.
A great place to see it is in the labor market, where you've seen demand cooling off a little bit from the extremely high levels. And there I would point to
اليد العاملة والبطالة.
surveys,
الطلب عم بيكون زايد.
hiring rate, things like that are really demand. There are also supply side things happening, but I think those are demand side things happening. You know, we saw, that's been a question for a while. We did see progress on inflation last year.
شفنا تقدم بالنسبة
Significant
للتضخم.
progress, despite, you know, financial conditions sometimes being tighter, sometimes looser.
وصلنا على 65,000 لأنكم عم تعملوا لايك. زيدوا اللايك بيعلى.
Michael McGee with Bloomberg Radio and Television. Can you give us more color on how the committee is thinking about inflation dynamics now? What we've seen at the beginning of the year, are they more one-off increases that will fade, or is there more of a secular turn with goods prices rising again and service prices staying sticky? And also, housing prices have been sort of the Godot of this cycle, in that you keep expecting them to go down and they don't. How does the committee see this playing out forward since you raised your inflation forecast?
So I see the committees looking at the 2 months of data and asking the same question you're asking and saying, we're just going to have to see what the data show. As I mentioned, you can look at January, which is very high reading, and you can, many people did see the possibility of seasonal adjustment problems there. But again, you don't want to.
أسعار هدول يمكن يكون لها علاقة بتوقيت معين بمواسم معينة للشغل.
Then February wasn't as high, but it was higher. So the question is, what are we going to see? You know, we tend to see a little bit stronger. This is in the data. A little bit stronger inflation in the first half of the year, a little bit less strong later in the year. We're going to let the data show. I don't think we really know whether this is a bump on the road or something more. We'll have to find out. In the meantime, the economy is strong, the labor market is strong, inflation has come way down, and that gives us the ability to approach this question carefully and
البطالة واليد العاملة في عمل جيد والتضخم عم ينزل كلها مؤشرات هو برأيه
Well, you've talked about the desire to have confidence that inflation is
65,300 البيتكوين. شفتوا قلت لكم كل ما تعملوا لايك كل ما يعلى السعر.
For inflation data dented that confidence at all?
It certainly hasn't improved our confidence. It doesn't raise any of this confidence. But I would say that the story is really essentially the same, and that is of inflation coming down gradually toward 2% on a sometimes bumpy path, as I mentioned. I think that's what you still see. We've got 9 months of 2.5%.
في trend line بدنا نشوفه.
And we've had 2 months of kind of bumpy inflation. We were saying that it's going to be a bumpy ride. We consistently said that. Now here are some bumps, and the question is, are they more than bumps? And we can't know that. That's why we are approaching this question carefully. It is very important for everyone that we serve that we do get inflation sustainably down. And I think the historical record, every situation is different, but the historical record is that you need to approach that question carefully and try to get it right the first time and not have to come back and raise rates again, perhaps, if you cut inappropriately, prematurely.
Go to Edward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Edward Lawrence with Fox Business. I wanted to ask you, you received a letter from, the Federal Reserve, first independent body, understanding Congress has oversight over that. You received a letter from Senators Elizabeth Warren and Sheldon Whitehouse that said, calling on you to lower interest rates, to cut interest rates, because it says, quote, the potential that it may remain too high for too long has halted advances in deploying renewable energy technologies and delayed significant climate and economic benefits from these projects. So has higher interest rates caused that?
Have they? Well, first of all, I respect, in our system of government, it is Congress that has oversight responsibility over the Fed. We place a tremendous amount of importance on our engagements with Congress and always treat them with great respect. In this case, I would say those are, our mandate is for maximum employment and price stability and the other things that we do.
هدفنا تثبيت الأسعار
We're trying to do that
وتخفيض
in a way
الفائدة.
that
هذا اللي بدنا
sustains the strong growth
نوصل
we're
له.
seeing, the strong labor market we're seeing, but allows us to make further progress with inflation. That's how we can best serve the public and leave the other issues, which in many cases are incredibly important, such as
ما في شيء عم بعيد ما هيك ما عم ترجم وقت تكون إعادة للأسئلة بيسألوا نفس الأسئلة بطريقة تانية
saying that the higher rates are squeezing the working people. How do these letters affect what you
عم
guys do?
بيقولوا رفع الفوائد على فترة طويلة عم يترك الأسعار مرتفعة وعم بتأثر على السوق.
هم قاعد يحاولون يطلعون منه كلام بس هو ما قاعد يعطيهم شيء.
ما بيسترجي لأنه أي كلمة بيهبط أي كلمة
Well,
بيخرب
but we
السوق
have to
هو.
make our judgments and we have to stick to our knitting, which is maximum employment, price stability, supervise and regulate the banks, work on the payment system, the things that we do.
Thank you. Claire Jones, Financial Times. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to ask a question. As chair of the FOMC, would you want to see unanimity on the committee or something close to it, meaning no more than one dissent before you begin cutting rates? Thank you.
We're very
بدك تشوف شيء معين قبل ما تبلش تخفض الفوائد؟ هذا السؤال كان.
organization, and we do try to achieve consensus and ideally unanimity. People do dissent. It's something that happens. Life goes on, and it's not a problem. We've always had dissents, and so and you respect thoughtful dissents very much. It's like you may not agree with some arguments, but you really want to understand them. So you may read a book that takes a position that you have long opposed, just to understand that book. So I treat dissents with real respect as well.
ماشي العالم بتحكي بس نحن هدفنا نوصل للمعطيات يعني إعادة تدوير الحديث ذاته عم يحكي ما في شيء يعني
Can you
جديد.
hear me? Yes. Okay.
يعني للحين اغلب الاسئله قاعد يرجع على نفس النقاط وقاعد يستخدم الكلام اللي هو قاله بالستيتمنت اصلا اللي كان اول شيء.
مظبوط. ما هو هذا بيكون مرجع له ستيتمنت مرجع ما بده يطلع عنها الا اذا ايام بيجبروه. هي الاسئله الصحفيه بيجبروه بدهم يكونوا ياخذوا منه معلومات بيطلعوه من ثيابه وبيطلع شي كلمه غلط. هن هيك بيجربوا يعملوا.
ايه قاعد يحاولون والله قاعد يحاولون يضغطون باسئله يعني من جوانب مختلفه.
In your books. Thank you. So we, of course, monitor it's one of our two goal variables. We all monitor the labor market very, very carefully, and I don't see those cracks today. And we follow all the possible stories that are out there about there being cracks. But the overall picture really is strong labor market. The extreme imbalances that we saw in the early parts of the pandemic recovery have mostly been resolved. You're seeing high job growth. You're seeing big increases in supply. You're seeing strong wage growth, but wage growth is gradually moderating down to more sustainable levels. In many respects.
عم يتكلموا عن ارتفاع بالويج جروث. ويج يعني هي المعاشات قيمة المعاشات وهالشيء انه بيؤدي للتضخم.
And surveys of workers and businesses are always interesting on this. How easy is it to find a job? How easy it is to find a worker? Those surveys have both come down. So the labor market's in good shape. You do see things like the low hiring rate, and people have made the argument that if layoffs were to increase, that would mean that the net would be fairly quick increases in unemployment. So that's something we're watching, but we're not seeing it. Of course, initial claims are very, very low, and if anything, have tracked down a little bit. So watching it carefully, don't see it. And when I say something, I use the term unexpected weakening in the labor market. So, we do expect the unemployment rate to, the forecast is that it would move up, I think, closer to what we see as the longer run sustainable level. That's just people's forecast, individual forecasts. But we're talking about something that's unexpected. That's where I'll leave it, though.
Steve Matthews with Bloomberg. You mentioned at the beginning of the press conference that the committee felt it might be appropriate to slow the pace of asset runoff fairly soon. I'm wondering, when you say fairly soon, does that mean that the committee would meet about this again in May and a decision could be reached that soon? And I was wondering if you could also just
هل الشيء إذا عم بتقول قريبا يكون التخفيض هل رح تجتمعوا بشهر 5 تقرروا هل رح يكون بهالوقت؟ امتى قريبا؟ وقت تقول قريبا شو قصدك بقريبا؟ امتى؟
or something in that nature? Thank you.
So that is what we're discussing essentially is and we're not discussing all the many other balance sheet issues. We will discuss those in due course, but what we're really looking at is slowing the pace of runoff. There isn't much runoff among MBS right now, but there is in treasuries, and we're talking about going to a lower pace. I don't want to give you a specific number because we haven't had an agreement or a decision, but that's the idea. That's what we're looking at. And in terms of the timing, I said fairly soon. I wouldn't want to try to be more specific than that, but you get the idea. The idea is, and this is in our longer run plans, that we may actually be able to get to a lower level because we would avoid the kind of frictions that can happen. Liquidity is not evenly distributed in the system, and there can be times when, in the aggregate, reserves are ample or even abundant, but not in every part. And those parts where they're not ample, there can be stress. And that can cause you to prematurely stop the process to avoid the stress. And then it would be very hard to restart, we think. So as something like that happened in 19, perhaps. So that's what we're doing. We're looking at what would be a good time.
هدفه يمشي على المعطيات، ما بده يكون متسرع وما بده يكون متأخر. هن بمنطقة حساسة كتير من ناحية الفوائد، مشان هيك ما في ياخذ قرار بشكل سريع.
So that our longer run goal is to return to a balance sheet that is mostly treasuries. I do expect that once we're through this, we'll come back to the other issues about the composition and the maturity and revisit those issues. But it's, not urgent right now. We want to get this decision made first, and then we can, when the time is right, come back to the other issues.
Hi, Victoria Guido with Politico. Also on the balance sheet, can you talk a little bit about how the outlook for the banking sector might impact your
فيك
balance
تخبرنا عن
sheet
وضع
plans? Do you
البنوك
worry
بالولايات
that as
المتحدة بالنسبة
deposits start to
للبالانس
shrink
شيت
that we could see more
والفوائد
turbulence?
اللي عم تعملوها شو عم بتأثر
We'll be
عليهم؟
watching carefully, but
عم
one of the
نراقبهم
reasons
بشكل دقيق.
we're slowing down. We will soon enough, fairly soon, I should say, slow down, is that we want to avoid any kind of turbulence. I wasn't thinking particularly about banking sector
ما بدنا
turbulence,
نشوف أي مشاكل بالبنوك، عم نراقبهم بشكل
we had
دقيق
some indicators.
لأي أمر إذا حدث.
The last time, this is our second time in doing this, and I think we're going to be paying a lot of attention to the things that started to happen and that foreshadowed what eventually happened at the end of that tightening cycle, where we wound up in a short reserves situation, and we don't want to do that again. And I think now we have a better sense of what are the indicators. It wasn't so much in the banking system as it was around, for example, where federal funds is trading relative to the administered rates, and where secured rates are relative to the administered rates, those sorts of things. We will always be watching the banking system for similar signs, though.
Well, is it also because you're not sure exactly how the reserve supply will react once the overnight reverse repo facility, drops nearer at zero?
Well, I think we broadly think that once the overnight repo stabilizes either at zero or close to zero, that as the balance sheet shrinks, we should expect that reserves will decline pretty close to dollar for dollar with that. That's what we think.
Go to Jean. Hi, Chair Powell. Jean Young with M&I Market News. I wanted to ask also about the balance sheet.
يرجعوا على قصة
You said
البالانس شيت
that
هلا.
starting the taper sooner could get you to a smaller balance
إذا
sheet size.
بلشنا التخفيضات
Does that mean you don't have to
بشكل
make a decision
باكر
on when to end QT
رح
at this
يكون
point?
سلبي.
And will you be setting
هل
up,
هالشي بيعني
the
انه
process for deciding
انت
that
ما اخذتوا قرار
sooner,
امتى
or
رح
will you
تبلشوا
wait until we're
الكوانتيتيف
close to the
تايتنينج،
end?
سياسة التشدد تبعكم؟
It's sort of ironic that by going slower you can get farther, but that's the idea. The idea is that with a smoother transition, you'll run much less risk of kind of liquidity problems, which can grow into shocks and which can cause you to stop the process prematurely. So that's where, in terms of how it ends, we're going to be monitoring carefully money market conditions and asking ourselves what they're telling us about reserves. Are they, right now we would characterize them as abundant, and what we're aiming for is ample, and which is a little bit less than abundant, right? So there isn't there's not a dollar amount or a percent of GDP or anything like that where we think we have a really pretty clear understanding of that. We're going to be looking at what these what's happening in money markets, in particular a bunch of different indicators, including the ones I mentioned, to tell us when we're getting close. Then though you reach a point ultimately where you stop allowing the balance sheet to run off, but then from that point there's another period in which non-reserve liabilities grow organically, like currency, and that also shrinks the reserves at a very slow pace. So you have a slower pace of runoff, which will have
slower pace of
fairly
بس
soon.
شيء
Then
عم
you have
بيعيد
another time
مرة
where
ثانية
you
تدوير
effectively hold the balance sheet constant and allow
خي محمد
non-reserve
فيك
liabilities
تترجم انت شوي، خلينا عندي شغله بس بدي فوت جيبها واجي.
اي مو مشكلة.
for brings it into a nice easy landing at a level that is above what we think the lowest possible ample number would be. We're not trying for that. We want to have a cushion, a buffer, because we know that demand for reserves can be very volatile, and we don't want to again find ourselves in a situation where there aren't reserves. We have to turn around and buy assets and put reserves back in the banking system the way we did in 2019-20.
Hi, Nancy Marshall-Genzer with Marketplace. Chair Powell, you said you're waiting to become more confident that inflation is getting to your 2% goal before you cut rates. Can you just sum up more specifically what data you're looking at that would give you that confidence?
Sure. So most importantly, we're looking at the incoming inflation data and the contents of it and what they're telling us. So that'll be, and also the various components. So obviously that's what we want. We want more confidence that inflation is coming down sustainably toward 2%. And I mean, of course, we'll also be looking at all the other things that are happening in the economy. We'll look at the totality of the data, including everything.
يرجع ويقول إن إحنا راح نطالع كل شيء قبل أن إحنا نسوي أي شيء يعني ما يبي يعطي إجابة على أي مؤشر.
More weight to like wages.
Wages is one thing. We don't. Our target is not wages. It's really inflation. But we would look to the fact that wages are still coming in very strong, but they've been wage increases. That is to say, wage increases have been quite strong, but they're gradually coming down to levels that are more sustainable over time, and that's what we want. We don't think that the inflation was not originally caused, I don't think, mostly by wages. That wasn't really the story. But we do think that to get inflation back down to 2% sustainably, we'd like to see, continuing gradual movement of wage increases at still high levels, but back down to levels that are more sustainable over time.
Let's go to Greg.
Thank you. Greg Robb from MarketWatch. Chair Powell, could you say at this meeting whether there were more officials who wanted to be careful and go slower about rates than were at the last meeting? Was there that sense of maybe it's smart to wait? Thanks.
I guess I'd put it this way. If you look at the incoming inflation data that we've had for January and February, I think very broadly that suggests that we were right to wait until we're more confident. So I think I didn't hear anyone dismissing it as not information that we should look at or anything like that. So I think generally speaking, it does go in the direction of saying yes, it's appropriate for us to be careful as we approach this question.
Brendan. Thanks, Chair Powell. Brendan Peterson with Punchbowl News. I wanted to ask you about central bank digital currency stuff. We've been hearing a lot from Republicans in Congress about what the Fed is or isn't doing in a digital dollar. But folks, I know you have said to Congress that you're going to wait for approval before the Fed does anything, launches anything. But folks like House Majority Whip Tom Emmer have said that the Fed is either actively researching or hiring personnel to study the implications of the CBDC. Can you give us any clarity on what the Fed is doing right now on a digital dollar?
Sure. So I think we've been pretty transparent on this, but I'll try harder. So we are not getting ready to, we haven't proposed, we haven't come to a conclusion that we should propose or anything like that, that Congress consider legislation to authorize a digital dollar. And it would take legislation by Congress signed by the President to give us the ability to do what we think of as a CBDC, which is really a retail CBDC with the public of it. So we're just a long, long way from that. What we are doing, and I think what every major central bank is doing, is we're trying to stay in the frontiers of what's going on in digital finance. And it has many, many different areas. It has applications in wholesale finance, in the payment system. And so we to serve the public, these issues have become very front burner in the last 5 or 6 years. We need to be knowledgeable about all that. So we actually do have people trying to understand things that are, but it's wrong to say that we're working on a CBDC and then we've secretly got a lab here where we've got one and we're just going to spring it on Congress at the right moment. We don't, I haven't
قاعد يقول انهم ما قاعد يشتغلون على CBDC ولكن قاعد يبحثون بشكل عام عن التطورات اللي قاعد تصير بال الامور الرقميه
we need to understand. We do have people who are keeping up with that as part of the broader payments landscape. That's how I would characterize it.
البيتكوين 65,650.
Thank you. It's Mark Hamrick with Bankrate. Mr. Chairman, April 27th will mark the 13th anniversary since a Fed chairman began holding regular news conferences. How important has that higher transparency been in your view, both for the proper functioning of the central bank and also in accomplishing your mission? And is there more that you and your colleagues can do on the transparency front, and what might that look like?
I generally think this movement actually started, 30 years ago, 30 years ago, when some academics posited that a more transparent central bank, if the public understands your reaction function, the markets will do your work for you. They'll react to the data. And so it all happens that way. And so there's been a march toward greater and greater transparency. And that certainly Chairman Bernanke advanced that, so Chairman Greenspan did, Chair Yellen did. And so we went from four press conferences a year to 8, so now every meeting really is live now. I think that's a good innovation. I wouldn't want to turn it back.
65,700 تقريبا.
We have an annual supervision report,
حطيت الترند لاين مالك على الشارت عندي.
I mean, there's a long list of things that we've done. I think I mean, nothing comes to mind as really desperately in need of doing at this moment. We're very transparent. We have no shortage of FOMC participants speaking to the public through the media. And so that channel is full.
Trend lines 66,300 بده يوصل.
Generally, broadly helped and made things better, but not every day and in every way.
Well, to follow up, has there ever been a day where you wanted to put that genie back in the bottle somewhat?
Of course not.
Let's go to Jennifer for the last question.
آخر سؤال يلا خلصنا.
آخر سؤال زهقنا. هي ذات الحديث ذاته
Not to harp too much more on confidence and inflation, but you did say earlier in this press conference that the recent inflation data hasn't raised anyone's confidence. But when you testified before the Senate a couple weeks ago, you told lawmakers that you are, quote, not far from receiving the confidence needed on inflation to begin cutting rates.
آخر مرة كنت عم تحكينا إنه الرابط يجيك التأكيد لتخفض الفوائد ولا لا؟
In those 2 days of hearings was really that the committee needs to see more evidence to build our confidence that inflation is moving down sustainably toward our 2%.
رسالتي الأساسية إنه نحن بدنا نوصلنا مع معطيات معينة لنقدر نأكد بالنسبة للتضخم.
I said that any number of times, so those were kind of the main part of the message. We repeated that today in our statement.
عدنا هالمسج الرسالة هيدي عدناها اليوم.
Really pointed out that we had made significant progress over the past year, and what we're looking for now is confirmation that that progress will continue.
بدنا نشوف التقدم بهذا المجال قبل.
Of inflation readings over the second half of last year that were really much lower. We didn't overreact, as I mentioned.
But given that you said that PCE for February 2.8%, the estimate, and that we have been seeing PCE, core PCE, coming down by 10% every month, I mean, wouldn't you be at about 2.4% this summer, June, July, to a point where you could cut then?
Well, we'll just have to see how the data
بدنا نشوف كيف المعطيات رح تجينا وبعدين بنقرر إذا بدنا نخفض الفوائد ولا لا.
In the second part of last year, again, we didn't overreact to it. We said we needed to see more, and we said it would be bumpy. And now we have January and February, which I've talked about a couple of times. So, we're looking for more good data, and we would certainly welcome it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
راح عنا. هيدي خلص دون جيروم باول. صعدنا تقريبا 65,800 ورجعنا ارتدينا. الترند لاين اللي عندي اياه انا اللي حاطط لكم اياه من عده شو اسمه تقريبا على 66,300 تقريبا. بدنا نشوف بس بيرفكت تيست. نزلنا عملنا تيست للخط التحتاني يلي هو الفيبوناتشي 0.38 اللي حكينا عنه وارتدينا. هلا بدنا نشوف شو بده يتصرف هون. في احتمالين. شو عم بيصير؟ لحظة بس. اوكي. في احتمالين، يا اما بدنا نكسر الترند لاين نرجع نعمل ريتست ونكمل صعود، او بدنا نرتد من الترند لاين هبوطا نعمل ريتست هون وبدنا نشوف شو بده يصير. يعني هون محلين بدنا نشوف، بدنا نراقب الحركة هون شو بده يصير فيها، ضروري نراقبها. المنطقة الثانية اللي بدنا نراقبها كمان هي هالنقطة هون تقريبا 68900 69000 رح تكون مقاومة. هل رح نقدر نكسرها بسهولة ونعمل هاير لو ونكفي صعود، ولا رح نرتد منها؟ هول مناطق كتير مهمين لازم نراقبهم ونشوف شو بده يصير فيهم. احد الاشخاص بعث لنا سوبر تشات من كان بده يجاوب عنا، وحكيت عنها اكثر من مره، شو صار بمنصه بيت ماكس من ناحيه من ناحيه الايثيريوم، من ناحيه البيتكوين. حدا باع بيتكوين كتير وهبط سعر البيتكوين بشكل سريع وخسر اموال كثيره. هدول المنصات الصغيره نسبيا بتكون سيولتهم قليله. اذا حدا باع كميه بيتكوين اوقات الاسعار ما بتمشي مزبوط. هلا هن عم بيحققوا بالموضوع ويمكن يعوضوا له، ولكن هيدا احد الامور اللي صار خاصه بالمنصات الصغيره. لذلك ضروري تكونوا بمنصات المنصات المهمه، يعني من باي بيت، باينانس، هول المنصات يعني اللي عم بحكي لكم عنه، كوين بيس اكيد يعني، اوكي اكس، بيت جيت، هن المنصات الرئيسيه اذا بدكم اذا تدخلوا فيهم. غير هيك شو وات هابن وذ ذا فيد؟ ما في شيء صراحه. الفيدرالي عفوا الفيدرالي اللي صار انه ما في لا بوزيتيف لا نيجاتيف، بده ينتظر المعطيات. بالنسبيا كان ايجابي جيروم باول يعني بشكل عام. هالشيء شفناه اول شيء بالهبوط الدوميننس تبع البيتكوين، العالم بلشت في تفاؤل صار بالسوق شوي اكثر. والبيتكوين صعدت صراحه وقت بلش الاجتماع، يعني كنا تقريبا على 62000، صعدنا يعني عملنا شمعة جميلة ل 65800 تقريبا قبل ما نرتد. هيدا أمور جيدة بالنسبة لي. شو هيدا؟ ما هو ما فهمت نهلة، ما فهمت سؤالك. اللي سنخ والله ما فهمت شو الكلمات، ما منا مكتوبة بطريقة مضبوطة. هسه شايفها؟
ما فهمت شيء.
ما فهمت شيء من هذا السؤال أخي. بنشكركم اخواتي، ما رح نطول اكثر صراحه، وقت كتير صعب بالنسبه لي انا. هلا بدهم يوعوا الاولاد، صارت الساعه 6 صباحا. ثانك يو فور everything. بتمنى عليكم تعملوا لايك وسبسكرايب للشانل، وبنشوفكم قريبا فيديو جديد وماركت ابديت جديد. ثانك يو اخي محمد.
يلا يعطيك العافيه اخ بدوي، نشوفكم على خير ان شاء الله. سلام.
يلا باي.